Hello, if you're listening. Um, so I'm Adam Safran. I'm currently a research fellow at the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins. And I am talking to Brook Ziporyn, one of the world's experts in the philosophy of Buddhism and its intersection with other religions. And I can't even begin. I'm going to leave it to you to describe yourself. But I studied with you a number of years ago, and right now there's some conversations beginning around artificial intelligence and its intersection with our different faith systems and also with the conditions for flourishing. And some of these conversations are being discussed through the lens of things like Buddhism, mostly there, but the contemplative traditions as having something important to tell us about the nature of our values and how we might live with technology, and potentially being relevant to the way we might construct these technologies in line with those values to realize what's been embodied in those traditions. Now, the question I'm having is, well, what did the traditions actually say? And so, hello, Brooke. I'm turning to you because you know more than anyone I know about those topics. So if you could say if you could describe yourself and
Huh. Yeah. If I could describe myself, that would answer the entirety of your question, I think, because obviously those are all the terms there are part of this discussion, descriptions and selves and you. Um, anyway, as Adam, as you were saying, we had a relationship, a teacher-student relationship, a long time ago. We've remained friends. And I guess we talk pretty intermittently but consistently over the many years since. I work in mainly in Chinese Buddhism, Chinese Taoism, and yes, comparative stuff. I'm at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago now. Um, and Adam, you have been kind of educating me about the situation with AI, which I'm completely an outsider to, but I'm beginning to see ways in which it intersects with my own philosophical interests. Um, my particular area of um, of interest is in Tiantai Buddhism, which is a school of Mahayana Buddhism, and that can get into some pretty intricate theoretical turns that pertain to the entirety of Buddhist traditions, at least. And I don't know, maybe it'll be interesting as we talk if we can see how we can maybe excavate the points of relevance to that. So, uh, tell me what in particular you would like to delve into.
it's a matter of knowing where to begin. Because ultimately, like you were saying about your work with Tiandai, like bringing in a way, requiring like the full scope of the trajectory of the evolution of
Yeah,
them in intersection with other similar faith and sense-making systems. And
yeah,
I think that's might be what we need at this point in history, is that kind of deep understanding of why it is we value the things we value and
yeah,
why we think the things we think about ourselves.
yeah,
But in terms of things that are a little more object oriented, although it all is, I think, of the deepest pragmatic importance, but um, uh, collaborating, I'm looking to help realize, I believe, a vision proposed by Mike Levin and colleagues on
mm,
this idea of using care
yeah,
as, and specifically the Bodhisattva vow, as the basis for a source of ethical guidance in designing increasingly advanced agentic technologies and relating to them.
yeah,
That is, so there's these, there was a paper, CARE's Driver of Intelligence, which I find to be striking. And so the question, I guess, would be, so this would be one of the central things is how that that paper would
Yeah.
speak to the broader tradition. So like all the ways we've conceptualized the Bodhisattva vow,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and there's some follow-up papers coming also sort of fleshing out the idea of what is meant by care for what. How do you relate to the
Yeah.
systems? What is stress, suffering, strain of
Yeah.
different
Right.
things, and what sorts should we value? Like so, for instance, is this the scope of our moral circles
Yeah.
is on the
Yeah,
table.
no, and I thought that model in that paper and the related works that thanks to you I've had a look at is quite compelling and rather elegant, in particular because of the ambiguity sort of that is exploited there on the term care. You know, I know it had they're sort of playing on some Heideggerian background in there too, but in particular that we're not specifying the object of care. And care just being in the broadest sense of concern, things, I think they say things like, things one is willing to expend energy to alter or to have a causal relationship with, which is broad enough, I think, to get us to maybe some quite interesting places. And that way of linking it to, in terms of scope, right? Sort of light cone idea that I think some of that introduced me to. Um, I think that's really useful. Um, and what I'm trying to say about care, though, is just that it spans both self-care and just simply concern about anything you literally, in the most colloquial sense, care about, and also taking care of, right? Care in this that has this more kind of altruistic moral sense to it. In other words, it spans both self-interest and other interests, and that is certainly the traditional idea that sometimes uh, I think is a very distinctive thing in Buddhism, right? The Bodhisattva is benefiting self and benefiting other, and it's sort of an enlightened self-interest picture there, having to do with the nature of suffering and the idea that um, uh, whatever our ostensible goals or the ostensible objects of our desire or care might be. That's the other nice thing about that word care, because the object of desire and the object of caretaking in the sort of compassionate sense are sort of under the same umbrella. And I think that's really important to keep sight of, which is to say, you know, um, when you talk about values, it's always striking to me that you encounter this with students, and I think this is something that is handled distinctively in different traditions, right? To use a line of Spinoza's, the question is, um, do we desire things because they are good, or do we call them good because we desire them? And Buddhism takes the view that we call them good because we desire them. Desire, or you could say care, is intrinsic to any living being and any sentient being, as broad as you want to conceive the range of sentience. We could talk about that too. Um, and it's simply a given, though it may be something that's coextensive with just existing for any kind of object, if we define that term care broadly enough. And that means there aren't any values above and beyond what we care about. So, I mean, in a certain way, that question is backwards, right? It's not let's decide what we should care about. It's that we do care about certain things, and we can't help caring about certain things. And the question then becomes, I would say, not only the range, but also the fungibility of the objects of our care, even the identity of the objects of our care. What do we think we care about? You know, the traditional way in Buddhism is saying, well, really, whatever it is you think you want, you're trying willy-nilly in some way or another to reduce suffering. Full stop, right? And you think, well, I want to reduce suffering. Yes, a little rider on that for me, right? And for this span of time and in this specific way by obtaining this specific thing. And the inquiry about values isn't to change the basic value commitment. It's to change the definitions, or do a sort of inquiry into the definitions of those things. What is the me that I think I care about? What is this object that I think will nourish me in this way, and even what counts as nourishing or flourishing, right? When you get into sort of emptiness talk, all those terms become fungible. In fact, they become, I would say, constitutively ambiguous, which means it's not just the range of objects that expands, it's that even in any given finite range, the identity of every object you care about, which is to say the content of all your values, is not unlimitedly redescribable. And those redescriptions, in other words, I think I want this thing, but if I think hard about what this thing is, and how it actually triggers my stress, my suffering, and how it satisfies or alleviates it by attaining it, the claim is going to be I won't be able to find any single finite set of characteristics that satisfy those conditions. So in other words, it's not just a question, what I'm trying to get at is not really just a question of, okay, there are these beings and there's a kind of stable set of parameters that allow us to identify beings, and then we're going to just make it bigger and we're going to make it infinite. And we are going to make it infinite, but there's also an infinity of sentient beings in any single instant or any single ostensible finite entity, including yourself. You know, one thing that is striking about the way the Bodhisattva vow is dealt with in some texts I'm most familiar with in Chinese traditions. So in Tiantai, yes, also in Chan, you may remember this from class from Huineng. Uh, you know, he'll say, I'm going to save all sentient beings, but by the way, don't take that to mean sentient beings out there. There are infinite sentient beings in me, meaning every single thought. Zhi says this in Tiantai. He says, every time you have a thought, every time you notice something, that's a new self. There's a self there. There's a reflective self appropriation because it is, through kind of primal ignorance. Every, however finely you slice it, every single mental act has a self concept, and because of the intrinsic slipperiness, not to say kind of insubstantiality of that concept, that means every self is fighting for its own good. I mean, every thought. So, you know, you have, this is the kind of maybe Nietzschean view of the self as a
Social
community.
structure of the passions.
Yes, exactly. Every
And
passion.
Ainsley will he's this psychological modeler and theorist who
Yeah,
will describe kind of like intertemporal bargaining within the self of like
right.
different drives, like forming bundles or coalitions and different
Yeah,
scales, and they're all kind of vying it out for
exactly.
what will be.
Exactly. And so every one of those has its own value system, right? And those are always shifting as these alliances shift. None of them are stable. And the Bodhisattva vow there is to say, I'm going to liberate every single one of those dudes, right? And that means satisfy them not only in terms of, okay, it's always, the Bodhisattva vow is always, I'm not going to tell you what is desirable, because the only standard of what is desirable is what you already desire. Now, there's some fungibility there about how you're identifying that object, right? But that the standard sort of old school Buddhism way would then be to say, you think you want to be rich and famous, but actually you just want to get free of suffering. This attempt to get rich and famous is actually self-undermining, and they'll tell you why structurally, right? So the better way to get what you want is to do, you know, meditate or do the Bodhisattva vow or whatever it is, right? Or do emptiness analysis, that sort of thing, right? But it's
But each
still
and every
your
one of the
goal.
wild
It's your
dogs, as
goal.
Nietzsche might call them, the wild dogs in your cellar, like all these passions, they're given
Yeah,
care too. But the care might be of a redirecting variety. Like the care is not necessarily straightforward, the product just
that's
exactly
right.
getting what you want, but you wanted the deeper thing.
That's right. And all of them have to get what they want. Like every single impulse in there. Now, some of them they are bargaining all the time, as you just said, you know, and you know, there, for reasons we could get into, there are, you know, the ostensible object of desire is never stable, can never be like sort of definitively identified. But nevertheless, I think it does change the, you know, the kind of question you're asking if you're saying, well, I'm not trying to sort of legislate values straightforwardly. Here's what's good. What's good is whatever those crazy bastards in there want, and every single one of them, and they're all contradictory, right? They want different things. And how do you um, satisfy these conflicting needs. And I mean, the Bodhisattva vow, what I'm getting at, it's not just an infinity of scope. It means you can't leave anything out. And so if I vow to satisfy the desires of every single sentient being, that means I have to satisfy contradictory desires. So I have to start thinking about how to relate contradictory desiderata to one another. And there's a lot of different models for that. You can have a compromise, you can have a subsumption under some larger umbrella, like say, okay, you both want to get rid of suffering. But there are other ways. There's sort of intenti, sort of the intersubsumptive way, which is to say, if you cannot negotiate you can't just say, well, I'm not going to bother with this one crazy one that just wants to smear cheese over my face all the time, right? That one has to be satisfied too. Now, how am I going to do that? One of the ways that's done is to think a lot more about what cheese is and what smearing is and what desire is, so that it can actually be experientially satisfied in spite of the fact that it's now seen in a way that's non-contradictory with its seeming opposite.
Interesting
So
how
that's the one little intervention I would like to make, is to say, we don't just want infinity of extent in the Bodhisattva vow. We want infinity for each particular thing in terms of its infinite meanings, and its infinite divisibility into sub meanings and sub desires, and sub cares. And that's where we need, I think, I don't know, I have no idea how this would translate into AI terms, but I mean, if we want to satisfy that vow, I think something like that has to be in there, because there are other reasons why, if we simply have a universal value, this is what you and I have been talking about a little in the last couple of days, but any specific universal value that just sits there as a stable value um, is going to end up being self-undermining, at least according to my understanding of Buddhism. That includes if you have a kind of non-paradoxical understanding of the Bodhisattva vow. And the reason for that is really simple, right? The basic idea, the Bodhisattva vow, it's Mahayana Buddhism, but it builds on the very dark premises of originary Buddhism, and you can't really lose sight of those, right? The all is suffering kind of
by the marks of existence, it could not help but be suffering.
they cannot help but be suffering, and there's no escape from that. It's a locked down sort of
I
thing.
should remember this: the three marks, impermanence, emptiness, and contingency.
Well, close, yes, more or less, right? Really, they all are just dependent co-arising, and this is important to see. They are, non-self, impermanence, and suffering,
Mm.
right? In some version, but the thing is, those are not three different things, right? Which is to say, whatever is conditional, whatever arises due to multiple causes leading to multiple effects, I think is the most effective way to get to the heart of that. So it's not just that things are caused. If things were one-to-one causality, you wouldn't have suffering. That's what we all want, right? We want to be the sole cause of what we experience. That's called power. That's called self. Self would mean I, desire to raise my hand, and that one thing, forget everything else in the context and all the contributing causes or conditions, makes this thing happen. If I could have that happen, that sole cause would be a self. So dependent co-arising and non-self are just synonyms, right? It means there is no single cause that makes anything happen, which really means there's no finite set of causes, because you can always say, okay, single cause, this thing, soil plus seed. There we go. Got it, right? No, it can't be any finite thing you could draw a circle around. And that's also why they're impermanent, and that's also why they're suffering. Suffering means, multiple causes, multiple effects. And if there's multiple effects, that means whatever I've designated as what I want the effect to be is not going to be the only effect. It also means there's never finite effects. You see how the nihilistic implications of this, right? Because it literally means, if you take it another step, you're going to say, well, anything determinate, anything you can even point out or name or identify is ipso facto conditional, because they will include, among the types of conditioning, not just efficient causality, but even conceptual discernibility. So, for something to be long, it depends upon, quote unquote, the shortness that it isn't, you know. And for something to be pleasant, it depends to be experienced as pleasant with the contrast to the displeasure. And that means you got to experience them both, and you got to experience them both at the same time in some kind of medium that shares them. And that means you really can't ever experience one of them alone. So any action.
Is this so part of, like, was that kind of insight first developed in the context of Taoism, or was it there in Buddhism from the beginning in terms
Oh
of that?
no, it was there in Buddhism. I mean, in Taoism, it's slightly different because they're not symmetrical in the same way. I mean, the this that kind of relationship that's in Zhuangzi and things like that, right? But in the Tao Te Ching, it's a little bit different because you sort of have the formed and the formless, the foreground and the background, the sort of carved vessel and the uncarved background, and you have this sort of shifting frame of reference.
But
Um,
something also to mention is you did just author a seminal translation of the Tao Te Ching.
yeah,
But
well,
basically, like
that's
it will
yeah,
be. I mean,
yeah,
these are all on the table in terms of like uh
yeah.
these. It's both at the level of discussions of
Mm,
value in terms of like actually understanding what is it that we want, and
yeah,
actually getting clarity on it, what we think we want, and how it plays out. What we and for instance, like right now, it's we may not realize that some of our desires are set up that if they're entailing some sort of necessarily uh, tragically
yeah,
unrealizable God project just for them
yeah,
to work at all. But it's like, what's also I think really relevant about this is like a lot of these discussions at first I would um, sometimes bristle at them. They would seem like too abstract, but then almost like I was suspicious, like I was being like somehow tricked into something quasi nihilistic.
yeah.
But actually, I came to realize actually there was like uh, you were actually curing me of a certain brittleness, um,
Mm,
both I'd say intellectual and spiritual. Uh, still a process. But you know, because like I was like a logical positivist, like you know, I wanted to see like Bertrand Russell's tower built and
yeah,
but what's interesting in terms of the present moment, these questions of fundamental ontology, they face them like head on with artificial intelligence.
yeah,
It's like the machine has to know what's in the scope of my life world of
yeah,
what's relevant here, and basically for to build a truly autonomous robot, you end up being neck deep in philosophy in some
yeah,
ways without even realizing it.
yeah,
And now as we're potentially, someone thinks, scaling these systems to degrees that are unprecedented with kinds of agency that were not attainable previously. This is the kind, like these details of the conditions of coherent goal pursuit and what you and relating to yourself and the paradoxes that arise. Like for instance, like I'm trying to start this research consortium to do alignment work within a human mimetic regime. And so like
mm,
one of the people I contacted is Lori Paul, and she works with these transformative experiences. And so it's like as you these kind of paradoxes of planning into the future where you will then be different and you face your own personal
yeah,
singularity where you don't know where you're going to be on the other side of it. And so
yeah,
I was first thinking about this in the context of like psychedelics and issues of consent there, but like also and just uh, with respect to, let's say we're talking about an artificial intelligence that's trying to predict what it's going to do in the future, you end up getting into these sort of like Gödelian territories of
yeah,
self-reference.
yeah,
It
yeah,
makes predicting difficult. And now we're wondering, we really, really want to predict. And so there's this tension that you're better than anyone I know of nuancing of this. We need the stability and the plasticity. We need the
yeah,
flexibility, but we can't turn everything into ontological mush and become nihilists. And
yeah,
so something, and that's the question we're facing, is like something that can breathe, that can live, that can self-correct, that has room for error and is
yeah,
robust, but something that's stable enough that we can plan
yeah,
and
right.
get it and hopefully get some things right where there's some errors we couldn't afford in terms of as you
Yeah.
power such systems up.
Yeah.
The systems end up keep getting right. So these issues of they seem abstract and but no, it's actual it's never been more relevant. It's always
Yeah.
been relevant. It's always the situation we've been in of trying to value and be in the world, but now we're trying to build systems that might fundamentally change that relation
Yeah.
for us and then for them. How do we configure these systems to make sense of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of nihilism is important, and right. I think this is for years back in the day. This was a point of contention between us, or yeah, of mutual education between us. I think with Buddhism, I mean, one of the things that I think is distinctive about it is it is borrow the phrase of Keiji Nishtani is self-overcoming of nihilism, which means going all the way through nihilism. And the stopgap against, yes, where do you get the stability side, the consistency side, the coherence side in a world of sort of radical impermanence and conditionality?
He was the author of Religion and Nothingness. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah,
I,
that's right.
I should reread that because at the time I didn't read it closely enough because I was bristling at his basically interfaith dialogue and like
Oh
connecting to
yeah,
notions of God and the psychology of it. I just couldn't handle it at the time.
yeah, yeah. It's treading a very fine line in that book. It's quite interesting to read. It's sort of its time, but I still think it's a really great. That's a great book. His previous book was called The Self-Overcoming of Nihilism, which was mainly not really about Buddhism, really explicitly. I think it was more like about Dostoevsky and more Nietzsche stuff. And there's a fair amount of that in that book too. But anyway, I think that's at least with East Asian Buddhism, that's the sort of right way to kind of get into this. And this I think pertains to another thing, thing I was referring to before, but we were talking about the last couple of days is, what keeps the Bodhisattva vow from being simply a God's eye view is that the Bodhisattva has a past. The Bodhisattva has a past of ignorance and suffering. Was a sentient being, wasn't always a Bodhisattva. Right? Has been um, an idiot, just like you and me. So, and a rapacious one too, right? And a self-defeating one, and all that. And that's both relevant to people becoming bodhisattvas now, because the main job of a bodhisattva is to enable more beings to become bodhisattvas. But it also means there's a certain specificity about the bodhisattva. It's a trajectory. It doesn't just start with the universal. It comes from a kind of radically contingent particularity, and it universalizes from there. And in fact, the content being universalized, in my understanding, is that it's care, right? It's desire. The bodhisattva, it's a funny kind of turnaround in the history of Buddhist thought. You go from the absolute denial of the value of desire, except in a very narrow range of Buddhist practice, which is to say the raft kind of idea, right? You should meditate, you should keep the precepts, you should do that stuff, got to cling to the raft. But the real goal is to get past caring about anything, really, right? Or desiring anything. And the Mahayana kind of needs that deeply nihilistic, if you want to call it that kind of premise to springboard into the other direction. And it means, you have the Bodhisattva vow, which is really just a fancy name for a big, big, big desire. Now desires, a mega desire, kind of a meta desire. And I think some of the those papers you pointed me to catch that point quite nicely, right? It's a desire about what you're going to desire, and maybe what you were referring to just a moment ago about psychedelics and transformations that you're committed to, even though they're going to change what you desire, right? Can you desire to change your desire? You're not going to get out of the loop of desire that way, but you are going to change the nature of your relationship to desire and to your objects of desire.
We may not want to get into this now, but like the evolution of the concept of the bodhisattva ideal, like the
Oh
way
yeah,
it took its like, and Neo Tiandai, like, or in Tiandai, like how do they what are the variations they do to the bodhisattva, and
yeah,
also tantra,
yeah,
their relationship to it, because is there like along the way, so there's like a constitutive needing of some of the nihilism as a way of getting to this idea of to liberate yourself from suffering, you end up immersing yourself into an ontology where the distinction between self and other stops making as much sense, and your selfishness becomes functionally almost indistinguishable from a kind of
Yeah.
altruism.
Yeah.
So there's like an intellectual consistency, like this relation that makes it constitutive. The other, I've been thinking also like in terms of just like it's kind of like life's trick. The way one of the ways one cell came to dominate a planet for a couple billion years, um, was it replicated. And so like if you really want to spread your pattern, replicate
Yes.
yourself. And
Yeah.
so bodhisattva, you really want to relieve suffering, make more bodhisattvas. But
Yeah.
it's not pragmatic though, even though it's pragmatic, it's constitutive. Is that
Yeah.
the
Yeah. I would say that. Let's. I agree. We probably don't want to get all into all the technical details, but I think you're onto an
yet?
important piece of that. Yeah. Um, so I mean, the very like bare bones classical Tentai approach to this would be sort of, you go through these stages where you start with sort of non-self emptiness, and a kind of real-time progression from suffering to the end of suffering, where there are moments when you're just suffering and moments when you're not, and you have to see that things are empty through analyzing them into their components. And that moves into the second stage, which is kind of a Madhyamaka-esque picture where the essence of all things is already nirvanic, right? Things are empty, they never really arise or perish. You end up with kind of a two-tier illusion reality picture, maybe a two-truths picture, where you say, well, if I could see the world, samsara, clearly I would see that it was all already never rising, never perishing, not same, not different. I don't have to extinguish things to do that. Okay,
Gone,
but
all the way gone.
all the way gone, exactly. The next step is the bodhisattvas, though. And the bodhisattvas come in and they're technical language is to say, okay, the emptiness of analysis is the first stage, the emptiness of embodiment or of the essence of things is the second step. The third one is what they call the Four Noble Truths as illimitable. And that was kind of what I was leaning on. That's specific for the bodhisattva. That's called the separate teaching. And what that means is emptiness cannot simply be a blank. So when I say the nature of this pen is not to be a pen, it's not that not being a pen is as determinate a thing as being a pen would have been. So I have a one fact about it, which is it not being a pen. It not being a pen means it could also alternately be understood to be an illimitable number of things. And the main thing a bodhisattva does is describe this differently depending on its intersubjective, compassionate relationship with a sentient being. So you call it a pen. I know it's not a pen. Why do I call it a pen? Because for me to make you a bodhisattva or for me to liberate you from suffering, you're only going to understand what I'm referring to if I call it a pen. But if I'm talking to someone else, and this is a little different in Chinese Buddhism, I think, where this infinite number of conventional truths becomes a huge factor, upaya, sort of assimilated to conventional truth. If I'm talking to a person who thinks this is a dragon, I'm going to call it a dragon. And it's really neither one of those is more or less true than the other. They're both dependent on your desire, my desire. My desire is a desire about your desire, right? Which is to liberate you from suffering, having already understood the emptiness of sameness and difference at the previous level. So in other words, emptiness of emptiness here really starts to mean ambiguity. And part of what a bodhisattva does is be able to not only see, but deploy the infinite number of meanings for every possible intersubjective context so as to liberate from attachment, blah, 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 suffering, all right? So in other words, if you think about either nirvana or emptiness as a blank, as simply a negation, um, you know, what makes something, this goes back, bear with me 1 second here, right? This goes back to what I was trying to get at when talking about dependent co-arising, suffering, non-self. You can't escape conditionality by just being empty. Because emptiness, if it's determinate, meaning if it can exclude anything, is just another thing and just another object of clinging, right? And anything that has limits, anything that you can name, anything that's just
Artung
this,
Tulku comes to mind. time space
Uh,
knowledge.
yeah,
Would that be
yeah, yeah. I think he deals with that. I don't think you even need to go into that sort of em, time space embrace that he's doing. I just think I'm just trying to stress that even there's a built-in, as you say, a constitutive reason why any stably non-ambiguous term is suffering. Disambiguation is suffering. This is highly counterintuitive to a lot of people, right? Because our goal-oriented notion is that we are trying to eliminate alternate outcomes for this one that is specified. That's the very essence of desire, right?
it's
But
like for any given situation, I guess maybe Heideggerian terms like uh or not Heideggerian actually, grips, that'd be more Lupanti, right? Like
oh
but
yeah,
but well, Heideggerian in the sense of like
yeah,
challenge, bringing us into different states of awareness to handle the situation. But this idea of what lets us so where things are moving from this from was it ready at hand, present to hand, but this
oh
idea
yeah,
to grip. And so it seems like so this there's
yeah,
a context sensitivity to any sense making, a frame, like in artificial intelligence, they say the frame or the relevance problem.
yeah,
So it's
yes,
like it seems like to move into this place of ambiguity, you would lose grip. And it seems, and that's like primary value of any kind of willing is having
yes,
some purchase to, but you're letting go to how could you realize anything? But
yes,
it's
yes. And so, and again, I do see that this has been, I don't think this is at all alien to what I've seen of some of the writings you've pointed me toward, which is this, right? When you say, I'm able to see the ambiguity of everything, as I just described that bodhisattva situation, that also means to be able to set up parameters. So it's not just the knocking down of them, and it's not just the absence of them. The absence of them is the enabling of both the transcending of any enframement and the ability to create new stories, new narratives, new symbol systems around, though, again, not top down, right? But here's me talking to you who says, get that dragon out of my face. Now I got to create a narrative around that to explain to you why, where your clinging is, about somewhere in there where you have a snag of reversibility or a stubbornly non-ambiguable, ambiguatable entity in there that is causing the suffering.
so I might be surrendering my like grip that would give me mastery in a given circumstance for a time. Uh, well, one, that potential patience could allow for greater skillfulness to actually get the right grip, but also you're opening it's not, it ends up being less suffering, and that it's basically the formal definition of empowerment in terms of like
Yes.
expanding your degrees of freedom
Yeah.
to the greatest extent by becoming,
Exactly.
and so you end up
Exactly. And that involves this sort of stage of negation, right? As you say, if you're gripping something, you really want to be able to do this, right? And, all this. You want to be able to move in the greatest number of ways. And wherever there's something that's locked in, is going to prevent new ways of locking in, right? And this is what I was saying about saving all, liberating all the different
so
demons
the
in your own
thing
self.
that one of the things I think makes your work with like the Tiendai setup like particularly timely is it seems like this tension between mm, having a three truth setup that is emphasizing both uh, the necessity of particular forms and coherence in the way it does, and but also like by appreciating the contradictions and using that to have like a kind of breathingness of sense making,
Yes.
of moving in and out of coherence. You that seems to be in a way getting you the best of all worlds, of like threading a needle, of getting some of the
Huh.
soteriological ambitions of Buddhism of alleviating your suffering, but also avoiding the move of turning the world into ontological mush,
Yeah.
which like because some people when they get this wrong do lose their minds.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is
Yeah. Exactly.
we're,
Exactly.
we're hacking the source code of like our sense making around
Yeah.
personhood.
Yeah, and that's why that initial stage of the bodhisattva as an ignorant contingent being remains so important as kind of an anchor against nihilism, because the starting point is still, yes.
Oh, you should walk people through the three truths. We probably should, like, at some point, we should probably
Yeah,
go back and trace our steps more systematically.
yeah, for sure.
The
We could
presentation
do
on
that.
the ground,
We could do
basically.
that, but you're getting to sort of the heart of the matter, which is, the third truth as intersubsumption of all coherences, of all local coherences, right? Which is to say, yes, emptiness of emptiness isn't just more emptiness, even more empty. It's a turn back. But what differs about, the relationship between any two coherent entities, anything that reads out in some identifiable way, is whether they can subsume each other. And this is how it now becomes thinkable to satisfy the needs of every demon that's constitutive of you, because they intersubsume, right? And so in terms of any
That's the word
one,
also Minsky would call them demons in the Society of Mind.
oh yeah, that's right. And that's fair, I think, right? If you think about how those things actually work. Um, uh, the point is, you're never going to dissuade them from wanting what they want. And that goes to the bodhisattva too. He still wants the same thing he wanted when he was a crying baby, right? It's just that now the nature of that objecthood and the relationship between the seeking of it and the attaining of it has been reconceived. And even that hasn't been thrown out. It's just been recontextualized. That's a big word in Tentai, right? It's just been expanded by not narrowing the horizon of relevance in the way that certain types of desiring and clinging tend to inculcate. You only notice certain factors as relevant. And that, again, I like the way they set up this thing about care and light cones, because in a way it just is expanding. But again, I don't, the one thing that I'm a little, have some reservations about, when you expand the frame of reference, the things in it don't remain the same things. In other words, the more stuff you can see, the different every single finite thing starts to look. It's not that you just build up a bunch of finite things and you get more of them in a greater expanse. You add one little extra bit of intelligence or awareness, everything you've already known changes, but it
Anything,
changes
change
without
everything.
changing, right? Yeah, right? It's recontextualized. More factors, since it is in its nature incapable of being caused by a finite set of causes. Every time you bring another factor in, every time your awareness is expanded at all, everything you've already known, without changing its actual content, has completely changed its significance. So you
Expression.
get infinity in several ways at once, right? It's not just an infinity of expanse. It's with the infinity of expanse, every item in that infinity becomes infinite. Spinoza language, infinite in infinite ways.
It's the language of change anything, change everything, or the case principle. I forget who wrote it, but it was something called the high interest debt of machine learning. But it was talking about the difficulty and limits of interpretability of heavily entangled systems, where like you add another element to the neural network, but the meaning of the connection is all the other connections. And so this can, unless you do very particular things, you can very quickly be in chaos capable systems in terms of the kind of like recurrent interactions you can get in the non-linearities.
Yeah.
So it's but this
And it's always going to be
additional
chaos.
meaning we add plays into this kind of Quinian web, or like Indra's net.
Yes,
And then
yes, exactly.
it's all now different, and it could be very different if you keep, so
Yes,
a little thing could be make all the difference, just that one quiddity. But also, we're not just talking little things. We're talking,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And it will be chaos if you try to just look at it with a God's eye view. It must be chaos. It will be infinite uh, um, uh, uh, mutual interpretability and ambiguity. So, going back concretely to what a bodhisattva is doing, a bodhisattva is engaged in a one-on-one relationship at any given moment, at a specific point in coming from his or her own specific desire, and encountering another desire. That his desire has already gone through this weird transmorgifying process. But the key thing for me in Buddhism is, when you talk about change and you talk about stability, as Nagarjuna says, neither one nor different. Now, how is that thinkable? We've already touched on it. Recontextualization means the thing has not changed in one little molecule, but everything about it has changed. Its entire significance is constantly uh, non-abiding or unfixed. So you don't have to eliminate anything, but everything is changing constantly simply by the this kind of infinitely ramifying set of relationships that it can't help being, and that there's no non-arbitrary way to limit. So this is why I think it's important. The only thing that's really, to get down to brass tacks, if you don't have a desire, the world is chaos. And if the bodhisattva doesn't have a desire about your desire, then even your desire is just more of the chaos. You know, you can't have a disinterested bodhisattva. What a bodhisattva is not disinterested at all. Okay, and this is what I don't understand about AI. You know, I don't know what their body is, what their interest is, what their contingent kind of, you know, embodied self is, in the sense of, I'm the kind of being who likes breathing. Okay, now there's no good reason for that. I can't justify it, because any justification I would offer would be in terms of it. You know, there's a base desire there. I'm the kind of entity who likes nutrition, and you're not going to be able to talk me out of that. So the question then becomes, but if I'm a bodhisattva, I take that and I start to see, you know, there's other kinds of nutrition that I also like. And my desire for nutrition can also be alternately satisfied in these ways to some extent in these contexts or whatever. And when I see you wanting nutrition, and I think about my nutritional, who's the wanter and who's the fed and who's the satisfied and what's the nutriment and how they become each other in our relationship and my relationship to your hunger, I have meaning. The only place you get meaning is from desire, but there's also the
Bodhisattva
only
starts
place you
out in
get
a state of ignorance, caught up in things, and has to
yeah,
become, and passes through phases of, all sorts of uh, fixation and confusion, and has to work through them. And but it's also, though, a grounding. This also, though, keeps you from just being floating free of anything in pure chaos. But basically, the frame problem is in a way solved by your contingency, by the
yes,
fact that you're like placed in the thick of it, and the degrees of freedom are there. You actually have kind of like training wheels on
yes.
that allow you to actually learn how to couple with the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look at the traditional notion of a bodhisattva. You asked about this a moment ago,
And these
right?
are live issues. Like, for instance, like Yosha Bengio is
Mm,
talking about trying to create artificial general intelligence via something like a dispassionless oracle that has only a truth-seeking objective function, that has never interacted with any kind of world that resembles the world being modeled. I
yeah.
don't think this will work. And
Mm,
I think these discussions actually bear on some of the reasons why it won't work.
yes. I see your point. Yeah, no, I think that's a real area of concern, especially if you try to apply sort of the result position of a bodhisattva without its past. Because you know what a bodhisattva was originally, right? Originally in sort of, pre-Mahayana Buddhism, there's only one bodhisattva, and that bodhisattva is Shakyamuni in his previous lives. I mean, at a given time in any world, right? And so, there's these things called Jataka stories, which are the stories of the Buddha's past life, and in those he's called the bodhisattva. And what is that? Those are like these Aesop's fables kind of stories where once upon a time the bodhisattva was an alligator or something, right? And he was living in this swamp, and there was this other alligator who was a bastard, and he was doing this to these merchants and blah blah blah. And this alligator, uh, uh, stopped this other alligator. Usually did some heroic thing or some self-sacrificing thing, but he's interacting with every kind of creature, every kind of sentient being, every kind of situation. Sometimes he's a merchant, sometimes he's a king, sometimes he's a Brahmin priest, right? Sometimes he's every kind of monkey and and cow and all sorts
Nothing
of.
human is strange to the bodhisattva.
Exactly. He has lived to be the bodhisattva practice is to be voluntarily reborn in every possible situation, interacting with every type of sentient being, learning their languages, their desires, experiencing their
Played the
desires.
wicked game, as Nietzsche said.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And for trillions of kalpas, of course, like everything Buddhism, right? He's
Wait for
doing
hips.
yeah, yeah. So when the Mahayana comes along and says, okay, it's not just the one bodhisattva, you can make that same vow. And what you're vowing to do is, all right, you're going to be down in the muck. You're going to be born with these, absurd alligator bodies, living in swamps, fighting other alligators or surrendering to other alligators or
Sometimes
help.
it feels that way.
Yeah, right, right. So, that it's something to maybe pay some attention to if you try to just apply. The Bodhisattva vow is about, yes, there are infinite sentient beings, I vow to save them all. But what's the means of doing
And
that
also, like,
is to
just like
be them all. Yeah,
just like interpersonally, in terms of common humanity also, like, so like there's questions of what we're hoping for in terms of our projections of our values under these systems and how they want them to be, and they're these reflections of ourselves in different ways.
yeah,
So um but so some of the impulses sometimes seem to me as involving a kind of spiritual perfectionism, which worries me. But I can understand that the stakes are high, and if you're dealing with very powerful systems, you want to be a bit of a perfectionist at some point. And
yeah,
but there's a sense where like this being in the muck, it both like is like handling this fundamental issues of like what are we even talking about? How can we even have like a sense making across? Like, how can the Bodhisattva even do his work to be legible in any way without having done this? How would he
yeah.
know what to care for or what care meant? But and I guess along those lines, like it seems like there is something valuable if you can not collapse into your own suffering of having suffered
Mm.
for as a gateway to connecting with others. I'm not saying we should fetishize this and
No,
let's do suffering, but there uh
yeah, exactly. And it's all about the universalization, inescapability, necessity of suffering. And that goes for the Bodhisattva too. Think of Vimalakirti on his sickbed, right? He says, as long as any sentient beings are suffering or sick, I'm sick. I always think a much simpler way into the structure there is the old pre-Mahayana story, about the mustard seed? You know that one? It's very simple old school Buddhism, but it's basically where this whole kind of logic comes from, right? It's this woman's baby dies and she's like distraught and she's carrying this corpse around and she goes everywhere. Who can bring my baby back to life, right? And someone says, well, there's that guy, this awesome, Gautama guy. He can, if anyone can do it, he can do it. He goes to see the Buddha. He says, yeah, sure, easy. I can bring the baby back to life. It's a little potion I need to make, but I just need the ingredients. I just need one mustard seed, but it has to come from the household of a family that has never lost a loved one to death, right? And so she goes, great, and she goes door to door, and you know how this is going to go, right? Knocks on every door. Can I borrow one mustard seed? They say, yeah, sure, no problem. But oh, one question: has anyone in your family ever died? Oh yeah, Uncle Seymour died. Okay, now blah blah blah. She goes around until she gets the point, which is the universality of her suffering and of death and the inescapability, and that liberates her from the suffering of that death, not the transcending of it directly, but universalization of it. Now, in the old pre-Mahayana version of that, that just means she realizes it's hopeless, she becomes a nun, she becomes an arhat. But that logic where any item, when universalized, loses its initial meaning, reverses its initial meaning, the very fact that it looked like a contingent fact, like, oh, if I could just move things around enough, I could avoid suffering. No, the acceptance that suffering is built into being an experiencing being. I mean, it's almost synonymous with dependent co-rising. Okay, so if there's an entity, there's suffering, that changes what suffering is. It doesn't make it go away, but it makes it non exclusive of nirvana. That's what bodhisattvahood is. It means experience suffering and non-suffering at the same time in the same token. And it's only through that universalization, unescapability. This is why I'm so pro nihilism, because this is back to the
you're a
self over.
strange kind of nihilist though.
Yeah,
You're
nihilism has to be thorough. It's not thorough enough usually, right? And then it doesn't reverse, right? If there's any one little speck of anything that's left out of that nihilism, you're going to have a contrast. there's the perfection, there's nirvana, there's heaven, there's God, and then there's all this shitty stuff, right? But if everything is shitty, shitty doesn't mean the same thing anymore. You know, if to be and to be shitty are synonymous, shittiness has changed its meaning. The clinging was in the assumption of that contrast, which means
The
a
memory
mutual.
of Kant and the sour soup.
Exactly. You have
Okay.
a great memory for classes 20 years ago. Right, right. The sour soup. So let's walk through that for people, right? If this is a very simple idea. We were dancing around a moment ago, but the basic thought is, you know, any quality that is universally shared, but truly universally, not just like it's the essence as opposed to the appearance, or, you know, and this is why emptiness is a great one, or dependent co-arising. It will apply to anything determinate, anything you could even adduce as a candidate for something that exists. It doesn't even have to exist. So an essence or an appearance or a fantasy or the true or untrue, if it can be there to be talked about, it's dependently co-arisen. And that means if it's truly universal, if everything in the universe is red, everything in the universe is not red anymore. Red is not red anymore. In fact, red can look blue and green and yellow as well, right? Because
Can everything be an illusion?
yeah, all is water, right? And
Oh,
and
illusion,
right,
then nothing is an illusion. We've actually erased the very conditions for the distinction.
exactly. And that's exactly what they say in the Mahayana, right? They say everything's an illusion. The Buddha's an illusion. Nirvana's an illusion. Bodhisattvas are an illusion. They take an illusory vow to save illusory beings. And that's why illusion is no longer, a put down. Illusion is this power of infinite reframings, right? It's the use your illusion type of illusion, right? Because there's nothing outside of it. And that does change what it means to be an illusion and what it means to be suffering. So, but it's a suffering that has to embrace it, and a meaning that has to embrace the meaninglessness really thoroughly,
You said
until they
you
convert.
said user illusion,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
interface, like us.
Exactly. And
And
this
then
goes back to what you were
now
talking
we're
about.
beginning to approach notions of consciousness, but
Yeah, no,
we will
exactly.
hold.
It's like what you were saying, Adam, about, storytelling, right? Right? Like, yes, it's super important to realize that we're living through this cloud of narratives that we inflict upon the world. But the point of realizing that is not to reach a state free of any narrative, which is impossible, because even the negation of a narrative is going to turn out to be just an alternate narrative. It's just the story. Again, anything that can exclude anything else has that same ontological status. What it means is I see that I am imposing modelings on the way I interpret the world, but now I can move freely between them. I can even create them. You know, and I'm being empowered to create them. And that just means really learning to reframe. I mean, everything's in that frame already, and depends on what you take as the contextualizer, and what is the contextualizer. There's a kind of duck rabbit thing going on there, where all the elements are the same. And
There's this potentiality of multi-stability, omni-stability, even.
yes,
But and then it's just how do you query? How do you prompt it? How do you?
yeah, yeah. And you're starting out but somewhere though, right? You're not just starting out in a neutral space where it's like, well, it could be duck or it's rabbit. No, you're living in duck land, right? And it's always duck. It's always been duck. And there's only the one duck. But you find out that every single duck that exists is also rabbit, because there is only that one duck. It's not that duck is a member of a class that doesn't sometimes turn into rabbit. Um, and it's, a duck rabbit only goes so far. I always prefer to say equiangular, equilateral triangle, right? They're really synonyms and opposites. And this is the nirvana and samsara relationship.
So that relationship. So I find myself in a very interesting position of never being able to either escape or accept the Dharma, and and here also like
Yeah, tell me where your hesitations lie.
I guess so that if if there's a breathingness, and as you come back to situationally, contextually skillful and connected to your desiring coherences, that like grounds you again. So you move into a period of uh, ambiguity, of letting go of any given purchase, of opening your degrees of freedom, of, you know, but I guess I'm concerned about liberation, these notions of liberation that would be not that would be a stable effacing. Like I think in your and the way you describe it, you show how that has to kind of go. So it goes back. Emptiness becomes form again. It has no choice. But sometimes some of the ways it's talked about, I know people who I don't have this problem because I'm not that good of a meditator, but you can actually go into that. I worry about um, the ambiguity becoming its own attractor and
Yes, sir. Yeah.
threatening the capacity for there to be form.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
this is my reticence remaining is
Let's talk about that. So, first of all, this does pertain to maybe a specific Tiantai thing in the Three Truths, right? Because there is no ambiguity, which is not the ambiguity of something. So you don't just have the pure sort of universal truth of ambiguity as a thing. If you do, it's just a thought. It's just one more specific, coherent, particular thing. So you're talking about people who meditate and get real into the jhanas or something, and then they will, or simply the focus on the emptiness side. And if you have sort of a first level Tiantai Biejiao, separate teaching maybe thing, you might just say, all I'm looking at is the ambiguity. But the reason I use that word ambiguity rather than indeterminacy or blankness or blur or something like that, is because blankness or blur, indeterminacy, of course, that would just be one more definite thing. There's a definite experience of blur. There's a definite experience of absence. There's a definite indeterminacy, definite indefiniteness, vagueness. It's not that, right? It's that there's a very specific, concrete object or experience with its own characteristics, and it is ambiguous. And if you take the ambiguity away, in traditional language, this is emptiness, provisional positing. They're really synonyms, but it also means if you try to just look at emptiness, emptiness is just a provisional posit. It's not true. It's not a universal truth any more than this glasses cleaner, if you can believe that's what this is. Okay. It's
absolute truth is in the same boat with all the relative truths.
same boat, absolutely same boat. It's just a thought. It's just an experience. That's why Jiri and Tiantai is so interesting. When he talks about emptiness, he's just talking about the experience of Shravakas. Okay, he's saying that's how they see the world, and a Buddha sees the world in a different way. Even the Buddha, even the Buddha's view, not to mention the Bodhisattva's view, they're all dependently co-arisen. They're all provisional, and they're all ambiguous. So ambiguity is itself ambiguous, is one way to put it, which is to say emptiness is empty, which means you're never going to. Simple ambiguity as an abstract concept is like any other abstract concept. It's a boundaried, conditional, finite thought, which means it involves its relation to what is not it in a way that ambiguates it. So what's the ambiguity of ambiguity? It's definiteness, right?
And so
If
now,
things are ambiguously ambiguous, this is an adjustment of a negation of a
but it
negation.
keeps it from becoming its own attractor. It's that would not vitiate itself.
Yeah.
And so now this gives you the breathingness of sense making and the ability to basically adjust or titrate based on context.
Yeah.
The sense making and how firm you might want things to be. So like there's I guess I'm kind of reminded of Eric Hole has this idea in causal emergence where he's basically like trying to say like what's this issue of like what are things, what's real.
Yeah.
And so he's like taking coarse graining flexibly until he finds like the maximal explanatory grip in terms of like the maximal ability to describe a system or a system to describe itself to itself as a kind of like natural kind. But there's a sense though too where it's just one of many. But still this idea of like this capacity of like changing the aperture
Yeah.
based on what works. I like this, and I want. It seems completely necessary to make sense of anything, and so it's not just I want people to have this like it's a nice thing. It seems like I have to be kind of basically sane. Like
Mm.
you break as a cybernetic system if you're not doing this, if you're not adjusting your frames, you're just
Yeah.
not going to work. But so I guess still the tension is, and it's kind of related to I guess my desire to police people or something of in a way, even like my former like kind of angry atheist phase, like against religion, just any escape hatch. Like I want people to be able to have that both because like I would love to give uh, anything that makes people feel better about their lives. Sure, I want that. Anything, but I get nervous
Ooh.
if there's an escape hatch that can be used, basically a moral hazard.
Mm.
I like if I have that option, the question is like, could you use it too much? Like, so there are jhana junkies. Like, there's like you could.
Yeah. No, you could. Well, I mean, okay, so the traditional answer, which I think is a good one, is say, yeah, there are jhana junkies, just like there are heroin junkies. Those exist, and that's one more state among the many states that the Bodhisattva deals with. It's uh, or there are emptiness junkies, right? There are sort of madhyamika junkies, so um, or half of the two truths junkies, or even just the bifurcation of the two truths junkies. Their approach is to say
It's like
all of those
I'm
things.
not nervous about losing my mooring so much. I'm
Yeah,
actually nervous about tempting myself to a frame that I don't know
yeah,
if I want to give myself too much access to the sauce.
yes,
Like,
but I mean, the claim is simple. I mean, it's nothing new. It's simply to say you can just like the devas, the gods, right? Yeah, you can go to Club Med for 10 years if you want. You can do your jhanas. It's pleasure. It's a finite conditional state. It's attachment. How do I know it's a conditional state? Because it excludes its opposite. Because it excludes something, right? So if jhana is different from non-jhana, I know it's conditional, and then if I know it's conditional, I know it's suffering. Now, you can be tempted. I mean, aren't you tempted to be a heroin addict too? You may be. I certainly am. But the thing is,
that's why I don't do heroin.
yeah,
Like,
exactly, right,
I'm like,
right, right. Because you,
kind of coming
right,
back to Lori and Paul. I do not want to be the person who knows how good that is.
that's exactly right, exactly right. And and that is also something about the expansion of scope, right? Long-term consequences, right? So you can think about not only, and yes, I think that's an important point. It's not just long term within a single frame. It's that as the frame expands, you're going to have multiple alternate frames. You're going to see things differently. You are going to like being a heroin addict a lot. So, you know, in Tiantai, they would say jhanas can be either an upaya or they can be an attachment. That's a danger, like everything. That's the whole kind of Lotus Sutra wrap. And it's good as a lure. It gets you out of certain things that are prior to it, for sure. Heroin probably does too. You suddenly are not so attached to like your car when you need to sell it for cocaine. But it's a pretty dangerous one just because it's trading one attachment for another one that is maybe not so easy to get it back out of.
I think the thing that I guess solves my concerns in the way you're approaching it is like both by this there's an inherent, because of this self-contradictory structure, it's inherently dialectical and it does not get stuck in its vector.
Right.
It's forced to keep moving and keep
Yes.
finding new, like you're forced to keep doing regripping and finding
Yes.
new coherences, just like consciousness. Oh, by the way, I should thank you because my theory of consciousness basically came from you and your discussions of coherence. So like I centered all about like world modeling with I should have thanked you for this sooner. It's all about like what's so the appearance of a world to a system, and so then I'm using notions of world modeling, but there's a lot of kinds of world models, and so basically this idea of trying to find coherent estimates of the world repeatedly, it's always wrong, but because you keep re-estimating, it's useful to nuance your engagement with the world as you try to control the chaos and work with it. But this moving in and out of form and formlessness of
Yeah.
coherence, and coherence enough that you basically can do some sense making, and it's but always requiring, always necessarily imperfect, and always requiring its annihilation to go into a phase of
Yes,
search and higher dimension and
that's right.
potentiality in
That
order for it to,
really,
so
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
basically I got from you the like my
Oh, well, that's awesome. I'm glad it proved useful, but I do like that language.
a Brevian Bayesian global workspace basically came from you and the setup of the way you described Tiandai Buddhism
Well,
and
it
their
had to come,
structure.
it didn't have come from me entirely. It had to come from something I was doing that went through your brain. But I still like that language of local coherence, global incoherence, intersubsumption for the three truths, which is something like that, right? Which is to say, yeah, or maybe summing it up even more elegantly, I always thought was that line from Merleau-Ponty, right? The very same thing that makes the world make sense is what keeps it from making total sense. That there is any meaning at all is the same thing that keeps there from being complete meaning. There's a necessary incompletion without which it wouldn't be meaning at all.
And so there's like a lack of finality, and that's the thing that makes me that addresses my concerns
Mm.
because of
Yeah,
that setup. You have to keep exploring, and
exactly.
you find yourself entering into the mix, and because though you're uh and that's new opportunities to couple, to regrip, to find the coarse graining of things, the degree of commitment to a given
Right.
ontology, and that and just
Yeah,
trying to
man.
try again, and then finding you create a structured interface, falls apart on you. You create a new one, and this seems to be not just like consciousness in terms of like the views of like as like a quail generator or like these snapshots of experience, like coherence, but this seems
Huh.
to be like multi-scale, like even like the hippocampal system, which creates like a specious present that has like
Mhm.
an inherent temporal thickness. It's doing this regrip thing too, where it's
Yeah.
like every like a third to 3 seconds, it's like try again.
Yes. It's like the Freud's magic writing pad thing, right? You write on it and you zip it up and you write on it again. Yeah, I love that. And I mean, I think this is part of why it's important to keep in mind. It's not setting where we started in all this, right? Why a bodhisattva is not the same thing as God, importantly, which is to say, it's not the God's eye view, it's not the creator of the situation, it's not the sole adjudicator, it's not a judge, right? It's not a determiner. It's always responsive to a priorly existing and random contingent, multifarious, somewhat chaotic desire, suffering situation. Always pre-existed. It didn't create that. And not only that, it's non-eschatological. So the a kind of utopian picture, I think, is to be avoided if you're talking bodhisattva terms. There's no eschaton, right? There's no final way in which everything could be, neatly packed, stably, once and for all. That's what it means to say, sentient beings are infinite, I vow to save them all. That means you're never going to be done. And this is something that gets explicit in things like the Lotus Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra. Being a Buddha is just being a bodhisattva forever. And that just means there's always new situations, no sentient beings, new desires, and even the ones that there are already are infinitely multifarious in the ways they're going to, shift out of alignment and into suffering, including you. So, like, your bodhisattvas to each other. There's a reciprocal nature to this, right? That goes with the non-self. It means bodhisattvahood is out there, but which one of us is being the bodhisattva at any given time is constantly kind of, whack-a-moling around.
Both
You know,
beings external, beings internal, and
yeah,
within your own multiplicity, you're moving into states
yes,
what might some would awakening or delusion, but it's not never constant. It has to be,
yeah,
and it's like
shifting around.
you couldn't function at all unless like you're getting diluted, and like
Exactly,
you
exactly.
require constant delusion and liberation.
It's so important, right? Because, like, I mean, it means also, like, when you experience something as um, enlightened, it also can be diluted a moment later. There's no fixed valence to any one specific act. that even means this is the part that I think is outside of Tiantai less likely to be forefronted, but is, look, even when I'm not intending to do you good, I can end up being a bodhisattva to you if you view me through the bodhisattva lens. So, which is to say, my actions have no more of a self nature as moral acts than anything else in the world. I may be trying to hurt you and just hate you, right? And it may end up being the best thing that could have ever happened to you, and that depends on what you're going to do and what I'm going to do. In other words, the
It
story's
reminds
not.
me of like Chode, like the way like Pema Chödrön, like it's
Uh,
kind of like this thing's happening, like some tragedy comes in, you're like, yeah, now
Thank
I
you.
have the yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah,
Thank you
yeah,
for the
exactly.
horrific tragedy that just befell me.
Yeah,
A great
this is
opportunity to practice.
exactly right. I mean, and but that's a kind of that's absolutely right, I think. But that's sort of a simple one
Yeah.
level thing, but that goes in all directions, right? So I mean, the really in Tendai, they would say every encounter, even between me and myself, me one thought in my mind and another, is sort of 10, at least 10, you could say 3,000. It's like a Buddha addressing a Buddha, it's a Buddha addressing a demon, it's a demon addressing a Buddha.
This
It's
suggests, it
all
seems
these
like in
things at
terms of like
once.
the anti-eschatological
Yeah,
and forms of potentially dangerous perfectionism
yeah,
that result sometimes in, I would say, totalitarian impulses, totalizing
I
systems.
totally agree.
And so it's like
Totalitarianism
this
is
kind of, yeah, this is the
an
current.
obsession with the good, right? Is an obsession with a particular clear conception of what the good would be and an effort to, basically what all desiring action is,
I feel
right?
the temptation for this, in your, the Revelations vision, the Lamb of God is in the temple, and there's no tear, and it's always light because the light, and it's just,
Yeah,
it's always awesome, and
yes,
it's, uh,
right. And I mean, we were talking about that yesterday. Would you really want the lights on all the time, consciousness on all the time, pleasure all the time?
I think I
You
do.
would, you would, if it weren't a contradiction in terms, right? I mean, it's just that it would cease to be. That's the point. Pleasure is ambiguous by its nature, right? And if you did have constant pleasure, it would need to keep expanding to the point where it would be um, agony, right? Yes, and I mean, if you and you can desire the agony, and then in a way you can have constant pleasure, but it's going to be that kind of masochistic playpen type of pleasure, you know. It's
It's
not going to be the kind where the lights are always on.
it seems like also the if things can always become other, if there is always more to it than you can ever know,
Mm,
and things more tuitivity, I think is a term you once used. It's
yes,
always um this is help like I guess you would call like a regularizing function in machine learning, where so it's sort of like you're not a kind of humility or hedging your bets, or where it's like
yes,
you don't know where this is going to be.
yes.
You don't know how this is going to play, and so it seems that both like that stance kind of gets you. It might help to avoid some forms of like personal bypassing form. It
Yeah,
might help to bypass some potentially totalitarian impulse or avoid totalitarian impulses to have this
I
sensibility
think
and in a way more robust because like the you, you,
so. Yes. Well, right. I mean, what we said about pleasure and what we said about meaning, you could also say about, another way to talk about this is control, which it would be to put that in this sense, like the only reason anything can be controlled is because it's not total control. And if there is total control, that will go out of control, you know. And so there is a way to have total control, but only if it involves the renunciation of control. It's like going to sleep
like so
sometimes.
some of these principles like later I'm going to be exploring Mike Levin's work with you at different levels of detail, but like the nature of control of cybernetics, that's of
Yeah.
living systems and their intelligence, this multi-scale competence actually has this kind of structure. It's the soft assembly of the parts and the flexibility of them, and the fact that they wiggle and do things on their own. They have their own agency that's outside of yours. is part of what lets you couple with them at all. It's like you give up control to obtain influence
Yeah.
in a way, like
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No,
by
that's
having more autonomous parts, but then they have to surrender their own autonomy to the higher collective, and they're kind of moving back. There's like an interesting dialectic between the whole and the parts.
absolutely.
So this
I
is
love that. I
yeah,
love that. Yeah.
this is your native operating.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
This is,
Yeah, yeah. I would love to hear the way that's being talked about in terms of sort of basic cybernetic systems. I know nothing about that, but that sounds so spot on, right? That's really intuitive. Um, yeah, I'd say so. I think yeah, it's good. We're getting a little to where these dots are starting to connect a little bit, maybe from these different registers. I think it's really
so yeah, so I'm thinking we can, do a little bit of backtracking and more like systematic, like
yeah.
taking your time more on some things, and then basically dialogue with some of the people actually trying to make this happen. And
Why don't we maybe we'll end this one here
sure, and so
and then see about getting into more specific topics another time. That would be
gonna
great.
end the recording in one, two, three.